In the last talk, we explored how the loop might form. As physical intelligence develops, several things begin to happen together. The filter of the mind becomes more established. Awareness becomes increasingly guided and increasingly capable of returning to itself. Memory allows the past to influence the present. Prediction allows the future to influence the present. Thought begins referring to thought. Experience begins referring to previous experience. The path becomes more strongly guided, while at the same time beginning to curve back upon itself. Greater guidance, greater return, and eventually recursion. Out of that recursion comes continuity, coherence, and the extraordinary experience of being me. But this raises another question. Can this process simply continue forever? Can physical intelligence become more and more sophisticated, with awareness becoming increasingly guided, increasingly recursive, and increasingly coherent without limit? I don't think it can. And the reason is actually quite simple. Every structure has limits. Think again about the optical fiber from the last talk. The fiber doesn't create the light. It provides the structure through which light can be guided. And importantly, not every structure can guide light in the same way. The properties of the fiber determine what it can support, what it can guide, and how that light can move within it. There is a relationship between the light and the structure through which it travels. And I think this gives us another useful way of thinking about physical intelligence. Different levels of physical intelligence provide different structures, different windows through which awareness can be organized. With very little physical intelligence, there may be experience but relatively little guidance. The filter of the mind is less developed. Awareness occurs, but the structure may not be sophisticated enough to return it consistently upon itself. There may be no stable recursive loop. And notice what I'm not saying. I'm not saying there is less consciousness. Consciousness remains in the field in which experience happens. What changes is the structure. With less physical intelligence, the filter is less developed. There is less capacity to guide awareness and less capacity for awareness to return upon itself. The difference is in the window, not necessarily in the field. Increase physical intelligence and the window changes. The filter becomes more established. Memory develops. Prediction improves. Experience becomes increasingly interconnected. Awareness becomes more strongly guided and more capable of returning. The path begins to curve, the loop begins to close, and eventually a stable center emerges. Self. But perhaps we shouldn't assume that because increasing physical intelligence produces greater coherence up to this point, more must always produce more. There is a tendency in the way we think about evolution to imagine a ladder. Simple life at the bottom, humans somewhere near the top, and perhaps something even more intelligent above us, as though intelligence simply keeps increasing and consciousness increases with it. But we've already questioned that assumption. In this model, a less intelligent form of life doesn't necessarily have less consciousness, and a more intelligent form of life doesn't necessarily have more. Consciousness isn't what is increasing. The structure is changing. The filter changes. The guidance changes. The capacity for recursion changes. And as that structure changes, so does the way awareness can move within it. This is what I mean by a window. The window doesn't create consciousness. It determines the structure through which awareness is experienced. And every physical structure has limits. Think about the human brain. Its extraordinary capability depends upon an enormous amount of coordination. Information has to be received, processed, compared, remembered, integrated, and continually updated. As physical intelligence becomes more sophisticated, the structure becomes capable of doing more. But maintaining that structure also becomes increasingly demanding. More information has to be integrated, more relationships maintained, more internal activity coordinated, more feedback stabilized, and eventually there may come a point where increasing complexity no longer produces increasing coherence. It begins to work against it. The very complexity that allowed the loop to become so stable may eventually make further stability more difficult. And this gives us an interesting possibility. Perhaps recursive awareness exists within a window of coherence. Below that window, there may not be enough structure to produce a stable recursive center. Within the window, increasing physical intelligence produces a stronger filter, greater guidance, greater return, greater recursion, and greater coherence. But beyond some point, further complexity may begin to fragment the very coherence it once created. Not necessarily dramatically, but the ability to organize awareness around one stable center becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. And if that's true, then human beings may occupy a very interesting position. We may exist somewhere close to the point at which physical intelligence can create an extraordinary coherent, extraordinarily stable, self-referential loop. And that would explain something important, because the human mind doesn't merely produce a self. It produces a self that can become almost completely convincing. I don't merely have thoughts about David. I experience myself as David. My memories feel like my memory. My fears feel like my fears. My future feels like my future. Awareness is being guided back again and again to the same center, and every turn strengthens its coherence. Perhaps this is one of the great paradoxes of being human. The extraordinary sophistication of physical intelligence gives us language, memory, reason, imagination, creativity, and an extraordinary capacity to understand the world. But the same structure can organize awareness so successfully around a center that we begin to experience that center as everything we are. The loop works almost too well. And suddenly, some of the things we're explored in the first two series begin to look rather different. The mind going around and around, the continual return to ourselves, the difficulty of remaining present, the tendency to interpret almost everything through me. Perhaps these aren't simply bad habits we've somehow acquired. Perhaps they are the consequence of an extraordinary successful structure, a structure built around continuity, prediction, interpretation, survival, coherence, which means that trying to fight the mind may be missing the point. The mind is doing what the mind does. The loop is doing what the loop does. It returns. So perhaps the question isn't, how do I stop it? Perhaps the question is, does every experience need to return to me? Because there is another way in which the loop can change. Not through greater physical intelligence, not through adding more complexity, but through something much simpler, less self-reference. Think about what happens when, even briefly, everything stops being interpreted through me. When you're completely absorbed in music, standing quietly beneath a night sky, watching the ocean, holding somebody you love. For a moment, There may still be thought. There may still be memory. There may still be a self. The structure hasn't changed. But awareness isn't being returned to the center with quite the same intensity. And something seems to open, not because consciousness increased. We've already established that. Not because anything new was added, and not because the structure disappeared, but perhaps because awareness became slightly less constrained by it. And this is where I think the direction of the journey changes. Physical intelligence took us towards a stronger filter, greater guidance, greater return, greater recursion, greater coherence, a stronger self. And that gave us everything required to become human. But freedom may not lie in continuing that process indefinitely. Perhaps it doesn't come from adding more. Perhaps it comes from allowing the structure to hold awareness a little less tightly. The loop doesn't need to disappear. The self doesn't need to disappear. Physical intelligence doesn't need to disappear. We still need all of them. But perhaps awareness doesn't need to return to that center with quite the same intensity. And if that happens, what changes? What does it actually feel like to remain fully human, to retain the mind, the self, the structure, and yet no longer be completely held by them? That's where we'll go in the final talk.